I was born on the 24th of February 1952 in Vryburg, a very small, backward, reactionary town in the Northern Cape in South Africa. It was, as I mentioned, a very small town, and it was part of, in historical terms, it was called the Republic of Stellaland. In the 1880s, the Boere, the Afrikaans farmers, established it as an outpost to serve as farms in the area. There was a very small but very tightly organized Jewish community that largely came from Kimberley, which was the center of the diamond industry, and De Beers, and one of the reasons for British imperialism's expansion in southern Africa. That it was a very reactionary place, but the Jewish community was there largely to service the farmers in the area. And my father was the manager of a farmers' co-op called the Boere Help Mekaar, the Boers, the Farmers Association, Self-Help Association. My parents had actually met in Israel in 1951 on Moshav HaBonim, which then was functioning as a kibbutz. And the Moshav was basically established on the ruins of a Palestinian village, Tantura. And the irony was that my parents lived in a house of one of the expelled families. And my mother had come from Poland. She had survived the Nazi Holocaust, and she'd studied music in Munich, but couldn't stand to be in Germany. And then she moved to Torino in Italy, continued with the studies, but essentially had a nervous breakdown. She couldn't adapt to life after the war. She had only 2 living relatives, both in Israel. One was the youngest brother of her father, but he was very religious and she was not religious. She didn't get on with him. And there was another cousin called Joshua Rosenwein, who was a printer. He worked at Davar, and he was a communist. I'm not sure if he was actually a member of the party, but he was to the left of Ben-Gurion and the other socialist Zionists. She came to stay with Joshua Rosenwein. It was in Rehov Frug, next to the Kameri. And my childhood was filled with these stories of the war and of the fledgling Jewish state, and these stories of Moshav HaBonim. My father came from South Africa. He was already second generation from a small family that had lived in Kimberley, had acquired some farms where they bought and sold cattle, and he had a bad heart. So he wasn't conscripted or enlisted in the Second World War. But after the war, as a Zionist, he was a member of the revisionist movement, the Beitari. He came to Israel, went to that kibbutz Moshav, met my mother. They lived in this house, which, as I mentioned, was an abandoned house, and got married in Tel Aviv. My father was born in 1922, my mother in 1923. So they were roughly about 30 at that stage. In Tomaszów Mazowiecki, near Lodz. She used to sing us lullabies in Polish. Ptaszek, panioneczka, dobrze, 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 straszna żywe, dziękuję, dobrze, dobrze, dobrze widzę. That's all I remember. And that lullaby, I'm going back a while, but the irony of my parents' history in Palestine.
The parents of your father came from Lithuania?
From Lithuania. They weren't religious, and most South African Jews came from Lithuania and first arrived in Cape Town. That was the main port. At that time, of course, there were no flights. People took a boat from the North Sea, reached South Africa, Cape Town, and from there spread out into the hinterland. And most of them were what we called in Afrikaans a smous. They were traders. They'd load up a wagon with goods to sell to the Afrikaans farmers and to the black peasants, who were very exploited at that stage. But the Jewish traders basically opened up the commercial routes from Cape Town going into the interior. And that's how they reached Kimberley. And in the 1870s, the diamond fields of Kimberley were discovered and exploited. And many Jewish traders then became involved in the diamond industry, but not my family. They were more concentrating on the sale of animal hides and livestock. So my grandfather had 2 farms in the Kimberley area, but my father decided not to go into farming, and he became this sort of manager of different trading stores. But this was both before and after he was in Israel. When he met my mother's name was Eva Kolska. My father was Samuel John Horwitz. But the English immigration officials in most cases tried to anglicize the Jewish surnames. So Horowitz became Horwitz. Horowitz is a Czech name. It's a village north of Prague. And in fact, one of my ancestors was the chief rabbi of Prague, the Ashla. And then before his death came to Eretz HaKodesh, and he's buried in Tveria in the same compound as Rambam. So I have a distinguished rabbinical ancestry. The irony was that my parents met on Moshav Bonim and lived in a house of refugees. And my mother was a refugee. And yet this very deep irony never penetrated their consciousness. The fact that they had lived in Israel, a part of this renaissance of the Jewish people, was all that counted. The fact that there were casualties and victims was something put to the side. I think to some extent it was almost subconscious. There was such a need for survivors of the Shoah to justify the emergence of a Jewish state that they almost blocked out the consciousness of what the cost had been to other people. So I grew up with this sense of the paradox of a survivor now, in order to continue with her life, sanctioning, agreeing with the expulsion of other people. And in South African terms, the Jewish community who had fled Europe in a position of dire poverty came to South Africa and were now also exploiting other people, black people in this instance, in order to justify their desire for a better life. So all of these ambiguities, the Holocaust, establishment of Israel, expulsion of Palestinians, Jewish people coming to South Africa to better their lives, but at the expense of others, shaped my consciousness. And that continues today. Now, my parents only were here for 2 years, but it had an enormous impact on their lives. And they always spoke of the period that they spent here as literally the high point of their lives. They only went back by chance because my grandfather was very sick. So my father went back to be with him and then became involved with different family matters. My father actually was not a socialist. He was from the revisionist movement, and going back to a kibbutz or a moshav was not what he wanted. He, for about 10 years after they returned, he looked at different schemes in Israel where he would be like a self-employed person. I remember one of them was to have a share in a fleet of trucks with some Israeli person, but it never got off the ground. So he stayed in South Africa. But my mother insisted that at least every 2 years she took a trip to Israel. And that became like a holy mission, to always come back here and renew contact, because she had many friends, Polish friends, who survived the war, who were living in Israel. Those were her closest friends, always. So in order to keep up that contact, she always came back. My father only came back much later, but she kept the contact, and we were all sent to a Jewish day school, which was very Zionistic. We went to Habonim, a Jewish youth movement. The focus there was on kibbutz, the epitome of socialism, and Zionism. So there again, my sort of introduction to socialism per se came through the Zionist lens. Of course, that's a tainted lens, but nonetheless, that gave me a foundation. I came to Israel for the first time in October 1967. Very soon after the Six-Day War. It was a special ulpan, which was organized by the Jewish day schools in South Africa. I was 15 at the time, very impressionable, and coming to Israel at that time in particular was quite an extraordinary experience. We were in Jerusalem. We stayed in Rehov HaChalutz, Beit HaKerem, and we were there for 3 months, and half of that time was spent doing tiyulim all around. When I say all around Israel, I include the West Bank and Gaza, because there were no borders then. There were no machsomim. In fact, it was really one country. You could travel freely, and there was no security, a sense of threat or danger. I mean, we were like 80 different young people. We traveled in 2 buses with some Israeli guides, and we were welcomed everywhere. And it was also an awakening for me, because the poverty of Gaza in particular reminded me of the poverty of colored black people in South Africa. I mean, at the time, you must understand that growing up, at that point my parents have left Freiburg. I essentially grew up from the age of 6 in Cape Town. My mother couldn't take the small, isolated environment in Freiburg and demanded that we moved to a big city where she'd feel more at home. My father agreed, so at the age of, when I was 6, we moved to Cape Town. So I in a sense, had an urban upbringing. But the contrast of black and white in South Africa was always so sharp that anyone of any sensitivity, particularly growing up with stories of the Shoah and the extremity of human cruelty and degradation, I wouldn't say I was obsessed, but I did a lot of reading about the Shoah. My mother spoke to some extent about it, but encouraged me to read and understand what happened. And there on our doorstep were the black townships, and seeing this vast economic disparity between our standards of living. And of course, every white family at that stage had a domestic worker, and in some cases a black gardener. So one saw these differences very sharply. So I was more than aware of the fact that most people were victims of exploitation. And coming to Israel, on the one hand, we saw a Jewish population that was largely egalitarian. There were not massive differences in the standard of living amongst Israeli Jews at that point, 1967, not like today. But on the Palestinian Arab side, there was an enormous difference. And Gaza particularly stood out for me as a very, very poor, backward place. So at that point, it seemed to me, ironically, an opportunity for Israel to open itself and encourage economic development in the Palestinian areas, to show that in actual fact Zionism, because I was a Zionist at that point, was not a threat. that in actual fact the arrival of Jews here should not simply be seen as displacement, that this was an opportunity for the local Arab population to also benefit. And that's why I remained a Zionist and finished school, went to the University of Cape Town. I studied philosophy and literature. I wasn't a very good student. I'm not cut out for the academic world, but I became involved in the student movement, the white student movement. I say that because the universities were segregated. There were separate universities for whites and separate for blacks. And black students had already, encouraged by the Black Power movement in the United States in particular, but also by the movements of resistance in South Africa, which had been banned in the 1960s. By the time I was at university, it was 1970. The ANC, the South African Communist Party, were all banned in about 1962. They'd gone underground, but there were still remnants. And a black consciousness movement started to emerge in the late 1960s. As white students, we wanted to support the black student movement, but they were basically saying to us, no, we don't want white participation, we don't want white leadership. We as black people must liberate ourselves. So to some extent we understood this. On the other hand, as the privileged children of a new white middle class, we felt, no, we too wanted to be part of a youth revolution. 1968, Danny Cohn-Bendit, Paris, you know, what was happening in Germany, the Baader-Meinhof group, the Red Brigades in Italy. We were not cut off from that, but South Africa was basically a fascist environment. We had to find our place as so-called white revolutionaries. And we didn't succeed in establishing contact with black students simply because they were not prepared to work with us. So we launched our own campaigns of protest. This was in 1972 in Cape Town, where for the first time the South African police charged and beat up protests by white students. So we felt the batons on our skulls for the first time. But of course, it was a drop in the ocean in terms of real resistance. Some of us started to become involved in embryonic trade unions at that time for black workers, because black workers were now barred from the mid-1950s from joining trade unions. So our interest was in trying to assist in the reformation of black trade unions, and we formed something called the Wages Commission, which I started to be active in. But ironically, I left South Africa after I graduated in quite a strange way.
We are speaking about 1970, 71.
Yeah, that's right. I graduated, I finished an honors degree in philosophy at the end of 1973. So that was 3 months after the October War. And after graduating, I went to Botswana. I heard about a progressive school run by a man called Patrick van Rensburg in a village called Serawi, which is in the center of Botswana. And he'd established a school, a high school, for this village, which was the largest so-called indigenous village in southern Africa. And he ran it on very socialist terms. The students participated in the running of the school. They had vegetable gardens, they had workshops, and it sounded like that would be an ideal place for me to go and work. I went there, and they said no, they had a full complement of teachers for 1974, but they'd take my name just in case an opening arose. I went back to Cape Town and waited. And after 2 months, I'd still heard nothing from them. And a friend of mine from a Jewish student movement, he came to say goodbye to me. He joined a Garin. They were going to kibbutz Nir Eliyahu. And he asked, you know, if maybe I would consider joining them as well. And I was at that point caught in a bit of a vacuum. And he said, well, you know, not as if you have to emigrate to Israel permanently, but join us for 6 months. We're on the kibbutz. It's sure to be a very interesting experience. So together with my girlfriend at the time, we decided to join that group. And in January 1974, we came to Israel. But the funny thing was that literally 3 or 4 days before we left, I got a letter from the school in Botswana to say, yes, there was an opening. But I'd already made all the arrangements, the tickets were booked, and psychologically I was now, all right, let me go to Israel and confront, as it were, my Zionist background. Because I'd already understood that the Palestinian struggle was something that a socialist should be supporting. But that I had to now unravel, in a sense, my own personal history. Because it was quite fortuitous. I hadn't planned to come to Israel, and yet somehow that's the way it would worked out. So we arrived at the end of January 1974, Kibbutz Nir Eliyahu, and it really was a very interesting experience. But in some ways, in an unforeseen way, I worked in the Pardes, in the orange orchards, and the people picking the oranges were Palestinians from Qalqilia. I was there representing the kibbutz in the sense of the pickers would load the agalot, the wagons, and I would drive the tractor to take it to the Beit Arizah, to the packing station. And I started to get to know the people. And the system of labor reminded me a lot of South Africa, because there was a Rais. In South African terms, we'd say an Induna. That's a Zulu name for the headman. So the Rais was like an Induna. The kibbutz dealt with him, not with the workers. The kibbutz didn't even sometimes know how many workers there were. There was absolutely no interest in the fact that the socialist institution was employing workers through a labor broker. They had no idea what the Rais was paying the workers. And in fact, the Asefa Klalit didn't seem to discuss this issue. So this whole pattern of labor exploitation existed in a vacuum as far as the kibbutz was concerned. I became quite interested, that's not the right term, more than interested as to how this was functioning. And I started to get to know the workers, and Qalqilia was, a kilometer from the kibbutz.
How you spoke with the workers, with the Palestinian workers?
The Palestinian workers spoke some Hebrew, but they didn't speak English. The Rais in particular spoke Hebrew. I mean, he was the link, the liaison between the kibbutz and the other workers. So I used to actually sometimes go and have coffee with him on Shabbat in Qalqilia. He was quite a nice man. No doubt he was exploiting the workers. That's the function, literally, of the system. But for me, it was more just like an entry point. But also, going to Qalqilia, I saw the consequences of the Six-Day War, because large sections of Qalqilia had been blown up by the Israeli army on the basis that it had been a center for terrorist activity. So Qalqilia was a very poor town, very poor, and the people there were desperate for work. So one could understand that they would come to the kibbutz. It wasn't an ideal situation for them, but at least they had some livelihood. So I started to pick up that really the system here in South Africa, the apartheid system, particularly of labor exploitation, was quite similar. But at the same time, Israel was, I must say, a liberating experience. South Africa, we had very severe censorship of political material, sexual material. South Africa is very conservative, very homophobic environment. Israel at that point was homophobic, but sexually more flexible, let's put it that way. So we saw films that were banned in South Africa, of every description. You could find books here, literature. It was a freer atmosphere. And I took a trip at the end of 1974 with my girlfriend to Europe. And that was also a very liberating experience. But the question then was, do we come back to Israel, or maybe stay in Europe, or go back to South Africa? We decided to come back. And I then took the decision, well, if I am going to stay here, the Garin from Nir Eliyahu had decided to go to the army, to Nachal. So I said, well, let me then go through this experience, and then I'll decide. Because at that point, certainly, going to the army was seen as a very necessary step in order to integrate into Israeli society, to really understand people, the consciousness, the mentality, the values, and of course to perfect my Hebrew as well, which was reasonably good but not fluent. So I went into the army. My girlfriend stayed in Tel Aviv. She didn't want to go back to the kibbutz. And I was at Machaneh Shmonim, infantry basic training, and thereafter a tank driver. We were first stationed in Tassa, in the Sinai, for 6 months. Then we went back to kibbutz for 6 months, and afterwards we were at Ma'ale Adumim, which then was a very small itnachlut. There were maybe 200 houses there. This was 1976, I think, yeah. But the army experience was also definitive for me, decisive, in that towards the end of the period at Ma'ale Adumim, we were sent in quite a random way, because we only did imunim, training in the deserts, We were not in contact with the civilian population at all. And suddenly we were sent to do srikot around Hebron, because there'd been some incident. The army wanted to check for hidden arms caches in the surrounding areas of Hebron. So they sent us there for 2 weeks. That was my first contact with the Palestinian civilian population. So we had to go into villages and do house-to-house searches. And I was never the one appointed to go into the houses. I had to stand guard over the civilian population who'd been told to leave their houses while soldiers went and checked their houses. At the same time, we stayed in the old Taggart fort. If you recall the mandatory Taggart forts in every city, we stayed there and we heard what was going on with chakirot, with interrogations. That for the first time I had a very direct experience of what the occupation was. And that was frightening. That really opened my eyes. And in fact, a group of us, I think there were 5 of us, 3 South Africans, 2 Israelis. We went to our commanding officer, who was actually a kibbutznik. We said, we're not prepared to do this again. We're in the army, we're in the tank corps, but we're not prepared to have any contact with the civilian population. And he was actually understanding. I think he was from a Shomer HaTzair kibbutz, and he said, no, I understand you, we won't send you guys out, we'll send other people, we'll make a plan. So we finished the army, but of course there was now the issue of Miluim. From that particular incident, they didn't send us out to... No, we'd reached an understanding with them. I'm not sure how common it was. We motivated to him why we weren't prepared to do this work. And he said, no, fine. And he kept to his agreement. But the question of Miluim, I decided I'm not prepared to do Miluim. I'm not prepared to serve in the army. So I took it one step further. Not simply to say that I wouldn't do Miluim in the Shtachim, but that I wasn't prepared now to serve in the army, full stop. That was my decision. The others, they continued to do Miluim. So I was faced with the decision, do I continue to live in Israel? because to refuse Miluim at that point would probably have meant, going to jail or something to that. I wasn't quite sure, but my whole relationship with Israel had changed in quite a significant way. I was quite isolated at that point. There were a few kibbutznikim. There was a man called Avram Khalifa, who was a very open person. He was a socialist, but still a Zionist. He didn't agree that, you don't go to the army full stop. He sympathized, and he sympathized particularly not to do the dirty work of the occupation. But he wasn't someone who encouraged anyone to not go to the army. There were a few other Israelis, actually met Ehud Banai and others who were on the kibbutz. And I'm also a musician, so with Ehud we struck up quite a friendship. And he at that point was very critical of what was happening, but certainly not prepared to take the step of refusing to serve in the army. So in order to clarify my thoughts, I left Israel. I went to England. There were many South African emigres in England at the time, people I knew from Cape Town, students who left South Africa, who refused to serve in the South African army, and were now studying in England, and they'd become active in different socialist organizations. It was in 1978.
Then you moved to England for the first time.
I went, when I left the army, I went to live in Jerusalem. I did some odd jobs, and then I realized, no, I must take a more fundamental decision, and I went to England. And in England, became exposed to a whole range of revolutionary movements. London at that point was a center. In an ironic way, the center of the past British Empire was now a magnet for revolutionaries from all over the Middle East and Africa. It was a free environment for publications, for meetings, and in London I actually heard about Matzpen. I can't actually remember exactly how, but I remember going to different meetings. The name Matzpen came up. And of course, at that point, as a South African, I could only stay legally for 6 months in England. So after 6 months, I came back to Israel. I only heard about Matzpen in London.
For the first time?
For the first time.
1978?
1977, 78. So I came back to Israel. And again, it's a bit hazy in my memory. I think I contacted Avi Gleserman, I'm not quite sure, but I made contact in Tel Aviv and started to go to meetings. And that really was my introduction to the anti-Zionist left in Israel. I then was living in the Kerem Atei Manim. I got a temporary job working at an art school in Bat Yam, teaching English. It was a very interesting experience. It was a working class school, Jewish school, and just the relations between the teachers and the pupils, the parents, and I was certainly way to the left of any of the other teachers, but I had a reasonable relationship with them. But I actually got on quite well with the teachers. We had political discussions. I didn't hide my views. I didn't quite tell them that I was not prepared to serve in the army. But they knew certainly that I was against the kibbutz and whatever else was going on. And then I was involved in Matzpen Tel Aviv. Well, I think, as I said, Avi Gleserman was my contact person at that point. Ehud Engel and Aviva, Herzl, Herzl Schubert, Chaim Anegbi, Gila, I can't remember her surname, right? There was someone from Turkey, I can't remember his name, one or two South Americans. could well be Ahmad, Masarwa, and Ali.
Ali Lazari.
That's right. So there were quite a number of comrades whom I remember. But at the same time, you know, I knew that to stay in Israel and be involved in a small group was not going to satisfy me, because objectively there was no social basis for a change. So I went back to England and continued there to be involved in music and poetry and other pursuits, and on the fringes in different revolutionary groups attached to South Africa. So my interest in South Africa was rekindled by that contact, but at the same time the ANC was not an option, because it was basically a nationalist Stalinist alliance with the ANC and the South African Communist Party. There were other groupings like the militant tendency, who'd, as it were an entryist formation. They went into the ANC with the intention of converting it to a socialist direction. There were other groupings as well. But I've always had a more instinctive sense that to work in open mass formations is more productive. I've never really been comfortable in vanguard parties. I think that to bring about social change, one has to work very hard to build class consciousness in a more open, democratic way, working underground. Maybe it's a question of temperament as well, but I didn't feel that that was going to really deliver social change. The ANC at that point also had been infiltrated by the South African security apparatus. Most people going back to South Africa had serious problems. They were picked up very quickly and didn't manage to achieve much. So I felt it wasn't the right time to go back to South Africa, and in fact I returned to Israel. This sort of back and forth between London and Israel continued for about 3 years. And then the last time that I came back to Israel in 1980, I was offered a job, a very interesting job, to take student groups to Egypt as a sort of tour leader, not as a guide, but simply to look after groups of students, maybe 20 students at a time. We took a bus from Tel Aviv to Cairo, and we completed a 10-day tour of Cairo and its environs, Alexandria, Luxor, Aswan. So I did that for a year. That was a most extraordinary experience. And I wasn't politically active, really. I mean, I was, but to a degree, because half the month I was in Egypt, and then coming back, and then for 2 weeks, and then returning to Egypt. At the end of that period, I basically took a decision to leave Israel. That as important as Matzpen was, I mean, we were not able to go and organize Jewish workers. We would sell the newspaper in Palestinian Israeli villages. No, I remember going. No, well, apart from attending meetings of Matzpen where there were many different discussions, we took the newspaper to sell in the Galil. We went to different villages. I can't remember all the names. Most of them were north of the Mishulash. And that was satisfying, but at the same time, I couldn't see this really creating a mass movement for change. The Zionist consciousness ideology was so entrenched in the Jewish working class that we were not going to factories to organize there. To put it crudely, we were a small group, isolated, with the right ideas, but with no social base to address. And that isolation, I felt, was not going to take the movement further. So, and having decided not to serve in the army again, I was now on the fringe of Israeli society. I thought, well, as a musician, artist, it's time also to develop my own sort of work. I returned to London. I had a band there. I worked in terms of music in Israel. I recorded 2 songs in Ulpan, in Rehov Frug. I think it was called Ulpan Eshel, together with Ehud Banai. He played guitar. I think we gave it to the radio stations, Kol Israel. I think they played it a few times, but it didn't get extensive airplay. So my career here in the music sector was very short-lived. I'm trying to remember the names of those songs. I've still got the record in South Africa. Nili et kochech, Nili. Oh, no. I won't pretend to remember. I'll make a copy of the records and send them to you. Yeah, no, they were quite sweet songs. The one in particular was a love song, which I think turned out quite well. I play guitar and write songs and sing. But at that point I was working with Ehud, but his style was more Mizrahi, and mine was more sort of influenced by Bob Dylan, American blues, reggae, and so on. I'm still in contact with Ehud. Whenever I come back, we meet and we exchange whatever recordings we've done. So even though politically we don't see eye to eye, as friends we still maintain the contact. Yeah. After I'd worked in Egypt for ISTA, that was the student travel organization in Israel, at the end of that year, I decided to go to New York. And I lived there for 4 years. I was involved in music, in writing. I did a range of things. I drove a taxi 2 nights a week, did editing, I did house removals. But it was the time of Mr. Ronald Reagan, his revolution, the neoliberal capitalist revolution, Maggie Thatcher. So politically it was a very bleak time. There was the war in Nicaragua and El Salvador. There was the war here, Lebanon, first Lebanese war. So politically it was quite a stressed time, but in South Africa there were the beginnings of a popular uprising. By 1984 there was a mass movement that had been rebuilt in South Africa, and I started to follow that quite carefully. By the end of 1985 I decided to go back to South Africa to check out what was happening and see if I could actually, participate, be of some use. I had made 2 trips back to Israel in that period, but politically nothing was moving. In fact, it was going, despite the withdrawal from Sinai, the Hitnachluyot had really started to, the pace had escalated. And one could see that creeping annexation was now, the creeping was quite open, and the intention to keep the territories was being made known. That Gush Emunim had managed to establish themselves and gain governmental support. And of course the Labour Party was behind all this, was the prime mover. So I didn't think of coming back to live in Israel. So I returned to South Africa in January 1986, and almost immediately realized that, this was it, something was happening. Of fundamental interest, the daily newspapers in South Africa at that point, the second page carried an unrest support. By unrest we mean where the police had been attacked. The police were going into the black townships to restore law and order, and people were throwing Molotov cocktails, throwing stones. They didn't have heavy weapons, but it was like the first Intifada. where a popular uprising was creating liberated zones of self-management on a mass scale. This was not a small avant-garde. This was a mass movement. And that, in terms of my political agenda and understanding, was where I had to locate myself. So I was in Cape Town where my parents lived. I'd gone there initially. Then I moved to Johannesburg in May 1986. And very fortuitously, some of my old political contacts were in Johannesburg. I re-established contact, and at that time, in June 1986, was a state of emergency was declared by the apartheid government. And I was living in a small flat in the center of Johannesburg, and these contacts asked me if they could use the flat for meetings of the new COSATU was the new giant labor federation, and the leadership of COSATU needed a safe place in which to meet during the state of emergency. So they asked if they could use my flat. I agreed, and in that way, in a very quick, spontaneous way, I became involved in the new movement. And literally 2-3 weeks afterwards, I was invited to work in a trade union, the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union, which I did for the next 9 years as an organizer, negotiator, and educator. And I became very involved in COSATU, because this union, Haru, was a member of, an affiliate of COSATU. So I represented the union together with the worker leadership. And that was the most remarkable period in South Africa's history. I mean, despite the violence, and there was terrible violence, it was also a very creative, energizing, and optimistic period, because we could see the end of the road. The apartheid government was struggling to contain this mass movement. It was workers, the unemployed, at every level people were involved. We were not waiting for the ANC to parachute in and save the country. People were doing it themselves, the local leadership. Unfortunately, the South African Communist Party started to sort of increase its recruitment of trade unionists and those who were involved in the civic movement to draw them back into the ANC-SACP alliance. And they were successful, because we didn't have another left formation which could take the place of a political party. So I did have to revise my earlier views, in that a political party of the left is as necessary as the mass movement. It can't be successful with one or the other. Where an individual chooses to work, that to some extent is a personal decision based on your own temperament, your preference. And mine was still for the open movement, so I stayed in the trade unions. And even though it's sometimes reformist work of a very limited nature, it still keeps alive the possibility for workers to gain a deeper, broader class consciousness and understanding of the system. Because without that, one can't actually challenge for state power. And at the end of the day, that has to be the objective. Otherwise, you're just treading on the mill. So South Africa, we became a casualty of the return of the ANC and the SACP. The deal was done behind closed doors. The mass movement was not part of those negotiations in any meaningful way. And people like Joe Slovo from the SACP sold us the idea that the Freedom Charter, which had been developed in the 1950s, would be the blueprint for the new South Africa. Nationalization of the banks, nationalization of land, of the mineral industry, the mineral wealth of the country, and so forth. But of course they didn't follow through with that. And COSATU and other mass movements were left on the side, although formally were part of the alliance. And at the end of that period, seeing the sellout of COSATU and the fact that its leadership was now captured, I then left the unions and I worked in other working class organizations and to an extent continue to do so, apart from keeping up my artistic production as a poet, writer and musician. So politically I'm still involved today, what's called the United Front, because 5 years ago one of the biggest unions in COSATU, NUMSA, National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, was expelled from COSATU because it challenged the alliance with the ANC SACP. So NUMSA set up a new framework called the United Front, incorporating trade unions and again civic organizations. In fact, in 2 weeks' time there's a big meeting, a gathering, to relaunch that type of mass movement. So I'm still on that track. In terms of Israel-Palestine, about 10 years ago, I mean, after the second Gaza war, quite a number of Jewish activists who've been involved in the anti-apartheid struggle formed an organization called Jewish Voices, which was to raise an opposition to the established Jewish community's blind support for Israel. To say there are other Jewish activists who have a different view, who support Palestinian rights, who want a socialist Israel-Palestine, and we'll work with the South African government to put pressure on the Israeli regime. Unfortunately, that movement itself disintegrated, but I've kept involved because it's had different incarnations, different sort of variations, and today it's called South African Jews for a Free Palestine. So I'm a media spokesperson for that organization. We're a small group, but we do participate in a forum of Palestinian solidarity organizations, and I think are doing some useful work. And that's the reason also why I keep coming back to Israel-Palestine, to renew political contacts, different projects, and just, with direct experience, understand what's happening, so that one can sharpen our involvement in South Africa, both through the government but also in general terms. The power of the media is of course considerable. So liaising with the media to provide information and counter the slander that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, because that's one of the key obstacles we face, is very important. So to have a Jewish group state that counts for a lot. It's an interesting thing. My mother died in 1993, and my father died much later in 2007. My parents were always liberal. They were not outwardly racist, but their relations with black people or Palestinian Arabs were very much sort of master-servant. It was not on a basis of equality. And my life has been very different to this. So I've engaged with people of many different backgrounds, colors, as an equal, and desired that. And I think to some extent succeeded. And my parents, through my experience, started to open up as well. So my mother, for instance, in South African terms, I'd say was a racist. She came from Europe. She never related to being in Africa. She couldn't quite understand how she got there. But having said that, she had a very comfortable life in Cape Town. My father, at the stage when he lived in Cape Town, he had a hat factory. And all the workers were colored people. In South African terms, people of sort of mixed race, to use that strange term, right? composite of the Khoi and the San, Europeans, and the African Bantu-speaking people. And he had very decent relations with people, but again, very paternalistic. But he was not a supporter of apartheid, but also feared change. People had a high standard of living, and the threat, you know, the black threat, the communist threat, that sort of propaganda had made most Jews support the establishment, support the status quo and the government. They voted for an opposition party which was liberal, but still looked at a qualified franchise, did not look at one person, one vote. So they wanted to control the situation. As they grew older, though, they did soften. When my mother, by the time my mother died, she supported my work in the trade unions. They never once said what I'm doing is foolish or not understandable. So they didn't put obstacles in my way. My father on Israel was always a hawk, coming from the revisionist perspective. But he too gradually started to realize that what was happening was unjust and also untenable. That for Israel to try and swallow the territories and deny Palestinians equal rights, like in South Africa, was going to blow up. That the future of Jewish Israelis could only be secured if there was security for Palestinians. In the same way in South Africa, whites couldn't have security if black people didn't have. So those questions he did absorb, and he changed. So we had a fruitful exchange on that ground.
ומה שאמרת בתחילת הדברים על שהם גרו על חורבות של כפר פלסטיני, על זה דיברת איתם, או שמה שאמרת שהם הכחישו את זה לגמרי, זה אתה חושב שהם הכחישו, אבל או שממש שאלת אותם על זה? שאלת אותם על החיים בבונים?
Yeah, with regard to that, they simply said they had no choice. That it was after the war, my mother is a refugee, she couldn't bear to live in Europe. The memory of what happened made it impossible for her, particularly in Germany. She hated the Germans. I mean, that was a deep emotion. Even to be in Italy with its fascist background, she couldn't deal with Europe. To go to South Africa was fortuitous, circumstantial. She had never understood that she would end up in South Africa. Israel for her was the sanctuary. And I could understand her feelings. I could understand it. And that emotional depth of her response to Israel was communicated to me and my brother and sister. So Zionism always had that aspect to it, of those Jewish people who survived an atrocity that's unimaginable, could see a sanctuary and then turn, as it were, the blind eye. I mean, my mother didn't participate in the war. She inherited, she came here after the war, 1950, lived in Tel Aviv. She was recovering from a nervous breakdown, and she was told there's a garin going to Moshav Abonim. She went there in good faith. The fact that now she lived in this house which had survived the expulsion of refugees, she just psychologically switched off. And she wasn't able to actually acknowledge in any meaningful way that what she had done was also, to put it bluntly, be the beneficiary of a war crime. That's the tragedy. That's the very unpalatable truth. Now, of course, in my situation, I'm another generation. I could say, but if there was no choice at that time, surely you understood that there would be further implications, that one has to live with those choices. And even today in Israel, in speaking about the return of refugees, of Palestinians, even from very liberal people, I mean, maybe a generalization, I find there is an across-the-board refusal to consider this, an absolute emotional block to say that Palestinians could return. I mean, to give an example, South African Jews for a Free Palestine, we have a project with the village, or the survivors of the village of Lubya. Lubya is in the north, it's between Nazareth and Tveria. It was quite a big village, which apparently there was a high degree of resistance from the residents of that village to the Haganah's encroachments. And that village was conquered and expelled, and then it was blown up in the early 1950s. And the Keren Kayemet then received donations from Jewish South Africans to build a forest, to plant a forest over the ruins of Lubya. Now, we understand that that's not just an isolated example. Keren Kayemet, as a matter of policy, in order to eliminate any memory of Palestinian habitation, solicits funds from outside, from Jewish communities. There's a Britain forest, a Canada forest, Australia forest, and so forth. So we approached, through the international campaign against the JNF, Atrid, and a few of us, I wasn't actually part of that delegation, came to Lubya and organized a ceremony with some of the survivors of that expulsion. As the Palestinians described it, a sort of a sulha, at least to express our regret that we as Jewish South Africans had contributed to such a program in recognition of the injustice. So those very direct things we can do as Jewish South Africans. And in fact, now we want to engage with the South African government that the government should demand of the Zionist Federation in South Africa and the Keren Kayemet that the name South Africa Forest be removed, the South African flags be removed, and that they acknowledge our statement that South Africa will not support ethnic cleansing. In the same way that in South Africa black people were dispossessed, we condemn the dispossession of Palestinians. So one finds constant linkages between apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel. And of course here there's a sizable Jewish population which is comparable in size to the Palestinian population. South Africa, whites were a much smaller minority, so the power dynamic is very different. But even today, I mean especially today in Israel, there is, I find, an absolute reluctance or refusal to think that Palestinian refugees have a right to return. And hence we get the murder on the Gaza border. And that murder is blatant. I mean, the world sees it. In South Africa today, there is a strong consciousness of Palestinian rights. It has yet to be translated into governmental action. But for the first time, we had the South African ambassador withdrawn after the Gaza massacre. Okay, the future of Israel. And I prefer to call this part of the world Palace Zion, recognizing there are two different communities, if you like, with their own histories, with their own interests, which I think can't be ignored. I don't think one can simply say a secular democratic society overnight will develop here. In South Africa, because whites were such a small minority, and black people were also very forgiving, almost too much so, it's been possible to create a situation of seeming normality. South Africa today has a very, very fine constitution. We have a constitutional court, we have a Bill of Rights, but we still have enormous economic disparities. And that's the cancer. But at a political level, it is truly an open and free society. And that's something to value. That's something that many people made an ultimate sacrifice for, but we can see the benefit. The South African Communist Party would speak of a two-stage theory. first political rights and secondly economic rights. Unfortunately, that negotiation it was too lopsided. So on the economic side, the exploitation of the past continues today, and in some cases is even worse. So South Africa, there's a lot of unfinished business, but politically it's quite clear that there's majority rule and there's freedom of speech and association. In Israel, we have a very different power dynamic. And in speaking particularly to Palestinians, they stress that there cannot be a negotiation that will be fruitful when this imbalance is so great. That on the Palestinian side, there has to be a unification. The current divisions are absolutely critical. I mean, they are, they're preventing Palestinians speaking with one clear, unified voice. And secondly, there is no real vision yet of a future society. In South Africa, we had that vision, which was a democratic, secular state. And because of the kind of population, the fact that white South Africa was not able to create a white state that was untenable, they had to accept an open society. In Israel, it's not yet at that stage. And in fact, the power balance is increasingly on the Zionist side. Palestinians have never been weaker and more divided. And the world, for whatever reason, whether it's Islamophobia, the rise of ISIS, neoliberal capitalist supremacy, is not able to check this creeping annexation and the fact that the Zionist enterprise is all-consuming. So one finds a high degree of despair amongst the remnants of the Israeli left who do seek a different scenario, with the Palestinians being so weak and the fact that globally there is no partner for a change of direction. So I wouldn't hazard a prediction as to what will happen here, but it's clear that Israeli military supremacy in the Middle East in general, not simply vis-à-vis the Palestinians, is a key factor, and that the United States, particularly with Trump as a president and Obama before him, has solidified this Israeli military superiority. And I mean, wars seem to break out here every at least 3-4 years. So the cycle of violence is quite constant. And in Israeli Zionist terms, that's the weapon to increase people's sense of insecurity. We've got no one to talk to, and we simply have to be strong, and if they raise one finger, we cut off the whole hand. So the lack of proportionality is also, a factor where for Palestinians they're up against the wall, and there's no incentive to find some common ground. Israel's basically saying all or nothing, and Israel seems determined to take everything. On that basis, there will be some explosion in the future, because the situation from the Palestinian side is untenable. A mass transfer to Jordan or Lebanon or Syria is very unlikely, because those regimes won't accept 3, 4, 5 million Palestinians, neither will Egypt. So we have a frozen, it's a paralyzed situation to some extent, a captive population, increasingly economically under pressure, without political leadership that has a forward direction. There's no mass mobilization now because of internal pressure, as well as Israeli constant security surveillance. So it's a very difficult and depressing scenario. One cannot see a way out. to some extent, given the South African experience, unless the Israeli left is able to build a more open, democratic mass movement of Israeli workers through trade unions and other structures, I don't see a chance for change in any positive direction. And the Histadrut is a bankrupt trade union movement. Koach Loavdim is starting out, but it has to build a base. But at least it's there. So that is a ray of hope. I would also say that Koach Loavdim is an example of how to begin to rebuild an Israeli left. And there, from outside, whoever wants to see a future for this society should be putting some effort into assisting this type of organization. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission established in South Africa was very important, but at the same time it didn't go far enough. Why do I say that? Because the apartheid interrogators, the apartheid criminals, they were given the choice to testify, and after that they would be exonerated of any guilt or responsibility. Not all of them did so, and there was no follow-up to prosecute them. So if there's to be a repeat of that experience, or that attempt to create a catharsis, one must make it very clear that the entire oppressive apparatus must appear so that the truth can be revealed. At the same time, it's very galling to see murderers walk away because of, it's a question of power. I mean, imagine if after the Second World War there were no Nuremberg trials. We know that maybe 40 people, the Nazi criminals, were executed, but thousands were allowed back into German society. And it took German society at least 2 decades to begin to confront the Nazi past. And today there's a new generation, and one hopes that they've internalized the lessons. But it's very unsatisfying to deal with murder, oppression in such a way. One can say for the future one has to make that sacrifice. But in Israeli terms, I think it's probably necessary for the left, if it hasn't done so already, to start making lists of those who are responsible for atrocities, and have that as a sword hanging over them, that the day will come when they'll have to answer for what they're doing. They might not at this point imagine that that day will come, but we say the wheels of justice grind very fine, but that they do grind. So one can only hope that justice will be met. But yeah, I think that the context of Israel, Palestine, the Middle East, is very different to Southern Africa. So it's not always useful to draw analogies. The Israeli consciousness has been informed by the Jewish past in Europe. It's been translated into Middle Eastern context, which complicates things, because it is, I think, a truism to say that the Palestinians have paid the price for fascist Europe's atrocities, and that shadow is very difficult to deal with. When it came to Southern Africa, the white minorities of South Africa and Rhodesia at that time, and Southwest Africa, were easier to deal with because Europe didn't have a sense of guilt. And that's what controls this environment, the European reluctance to step in and say, look, you've already got a Jewish state, don't want the whole cake. Because in terms of reading about in the 1920s in Israel-Palestine, the Zionists had a very clear understanding that a Jewish state could only emerge if the Arab population was expelled. They made no bones about it, and they followed through. The fact that the Second World War came about with enormous consequences for Jewish populations helped solidify that sense that no price is too high to pay in a moral sense. The result is that Israeli society has no moral sense. There is no moral compass here as to what is right or wrong. Everything can be sacrificed, as it were, for the Zionist ideal. So the Zionist ideal is maximalist. It might have started off, yes, we'll accept partition, but we'll clear Arabs from the area allocated to Jews. In terms of the military situation, it was possible to seize more territory, to expel more Arabs. Now it's possible in the West Bank, Gaza, to clear further populations, or at least put pressure on them. The Zionism is without a sense of right or wrong, other than does it serve our interest to create a Jewish state in the maximum territory possible. Whether we have to deal with neo-Nazis in South Africa, as was the case, to develop an atomic weapon. South Africa was filled, the Nationalist Party, half of them had been in a Nazi organization called the Ossewa Brandwacht in the Second World War. They'd been interned, in fact, but they did the deal with Perez and others in the 1970s. Whether it's Orban today from Hungary, whether it's Trump today in the United States. We, the Jewish people, are now supping with the devil on a very regular basis. And we claim it in pursuit of our own survival and security. So as someone who's completely secularized and a socialist, my Jewish cultural history keeps me involved here. And seeing the fact that Zionism claims to speak for all Jews, wherever you are, and uses Jewish communities, whether it's in the United States, South Africa, Australia, to put pressure on those governments to support Israel in every respect, means that every Jewish person now is in the front line. Every Jewish person is responsible, so to speak, for what Israel does. Because at first, I didn't want to be involved in an ethnic Jewish organization like Jewish Voices. I was a socialist involved in Southern Africa. But as the Zionist Federation in South Africa kept stressing, Israel represents us as well as Jewish South Africans. Well, we felt it necessary to create a platform for another voice. We most definitely support BDS as a non-violent response and as a weapon which is successful. South Africa, there were different, if you like, aspects to the struggle. The first and most important was the internal mass mobilization. That without question. The second was the agitation of outside groupings, liberation movements, to secure political support for a democratic one-person, one-vote South Africa. And the third was BDS, particularly financial sanctions, military sanctions, and the cultural boycott. And as South African Jews for a Free Palestine, we support BDS wholeheartedly, and we believe the South African government should play a leading role on a diplomatic level, economic level, to enforce BDS. Of course, in Israel, BDS is the great devil. BDS is seen as the biggest threat, and that only reinforces my sense that that's the most appropriate weapon for activists outside of Israel to push. Apart from supporting within Israel-Palestine those groupings that are socialist in orientation, because I don't think that it's advisable to cut all links with Israel or Palestine, particularly with Israel. I think where we can, we must work together. the Israeli left and Jewish activists outside and other groupings, secular groupings, in order to bring about change. The problem now is that there's no overarching organization. There's no umbrella where we can come together. I mean, personally, I've discussed this with a number of comrades, both in Israel, Palestine, United States, Britain, to say, let us create the structure where we define what our objectives are and how we reach them. But the moment there's a fragmentation, I mean, within the Palestinian solidarity world, there is also a lack of that type of central organizing. Within the Jewish solidarity world for Israel-Palestine, there's also no such a structure. And within Israel itself, I understand, there is no such structure. I think that would be a point of departure, to come together, whether it's here or some other venue, and really begin to give put some flesh on the skeleton. Because BDS is certainly a powerful movement, and it's gaining strength. And it's at that point where soon it will start to influence national governments. But it needs that extra, if you like, muscle to be able to do that. Political action can only be fruitful when you have the different elements in place. And in Israel, there's no mass movement for change. There's no, if you like, class base for this at this point in time. So it's very difficult to think of real fundamental change. And military speaking, this is the superpower. And speaking to Palestinians, comrades, and just people in general, there is a terrible sense of despair, of unease. People experience the Israeli juggernaut, this massive power that is able to twist the United States, the EU. There's no country that can stand up to Israel. It's this military, colossus. The Israeli economy is so powerful. The Arab world is so divided. Palestinians themselves are divided. There's just a sense of waiting for something to happen, and just quietly continuing, but almost that survival itself is a victory. And the term sumud, that endurance, just put your head down and hope that the cyclone will pass over and that the house will still be standing. But it fills me with great sorrow and despair also. How can this change? I mean, what is human life? The pain of it, the fact that you have to swallow the indignity, the humiliation of powerlessness. I mean, growing up in South Africa and seeing the way that black people were treated, that's what aroused me. Seeing the photographs of Auschwitz, the pits filled with human bodies, of corpses, that's what makes one sensitized to human suffering. And that Palestinians today feel that the Jews have been the carriers of this cataclysm for them, this Nakba, is really terrifying. And it fills one with despair that human beings everywhere don't seem to learn from history, don't seem to understand that recognition of the other is also recognition of yourself. It's self-denial for a people like the Jews to ignore the sufferings of those who they themselves have put in this position. Coming to Israel is always a very sharp emotional experience for me. It's not an easy thing. I don't come here on holiday. I come here to renew my understanding of what's happening and take that back to continue to be active. Because it's tragic. It's a tragedy for the Jewish people and certainly for the Palestinians. So, yeah, it's not a very comforting feeling to be here, particularly in Tel Aviv to some extent, because it's like sitting in white Cape Town. A few kilometers were the black townships, and white people were oblivious to that suffering. So in Tel Aviv, life goes on. It's like a European city to some extent. It has a different sort of flavor, but young people in particular are oblivious to the consequences of the policies of their society. That's not very healthy. It's the brutalization of Israeli youth that also frightens me, but to a high degree, that young people think this is normal. This is the way things should be and the way they'll carry on. There's no sense of the consequences of Israeli actions. And in speaking to people about what happened on the Gaza border, the massacre, almost everyone I've met has said, well, what can we do? We can't allow thousands of them just to cross the border. We have to take action. They don't think that there was another way to manage this. But of course, the real issue is the roots of the problem. Deal with the roots, not the symptoms. I think, as I've said, the most depressing is the terrible Israeli blindness, indifference to the consequences of these policies. Particularly, I mean, if a two-state solution is not acceptable because of this desire to expand Jewish living room, then what's the alternative? The alternative is only one state, a single democratic secular state with rights for all. But that Israelis are so racist, and really the only word is racist with regard to Arabs, Palestinians, makes that possibility almost unimaginable. So that would be the root of one's despair, that Israelis themselves cannot see any type of coexistence with people in the Middle East. It's a European ghetto. It's the American, 52nd, 53rd state, and that this will continue indefinitely. What is some sort of sense of optimism, that one meets amazing people, people's sensitivity, who are a small minority within the Jewish environment, but amongst Palestinians I've met many people who are really reaching out, who want to find some way to coexist, who recognize it's not a question of driving the Jews into the sea. That's Zionist propaganda. There isn't that sense. There is, whether it's coming from a point of weakness or it's a point of, well, we have to accept the fact that there are now 7 million Jews, yeah? They are our overlords at this point. They are our exploiters at this point. But we have to, as difficult as it is, imagine a future with them. I do find that, particularly amongst Israeli Palestinians, but also with Palestinians on the West Bank. There is a sense that this issue's gone too far, that the two-state solution is actually a myth now. It's a lie. It's not going to happen. So what is now the alternative? So this new, if you like, consciousness, I imagine in time will create a new political framework. Something must arise out of this. Whether one can be a prophet and anticipate what that will be is obviously not on the agenda. But I think some political movement will arise. But then again, it goes back to my earlier point, that this has to be created. That can only happen if there's an organization or some platform where these different inputs can be made and some plan of action arise. The one state, two nations is a new development, I understand, but it seems to be detached from any organizational base. So again, it's a small group of people without that type of muscle. And that's why I'd say that one must again look to trade unions and other organizations. It's a slow process, but to bring Jewish and Palestinian workers together based on their current real lived experiences, which are those of exploitation across the board.